My name is Victoria Sterling, and the last words my mother spoke to me were through a text message that arrived while I was completing a classified mission in Eastern Europe. Don't come to your father's funeral. You're not welcome here. 3 days later, as my family gathered to bury the man who had shaped every principle I lived by, a 4-star general walked into that funeral home and said 5 words that would change everything. "Colonel, we've been looking for you. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you." The text message from my mother, Patricia Sterling, had arrived at 0347 hours on a Tuesday morning, while I was positioned in a concrete bunker overlooking the Carpathian Mountain. My unit had been tracking a terrorist cell for 6 weeks, and we were 12 hours away from executing an operation that would prevent what intelligence suggested could be a coordinated attack on civilian targets across 3 European capitals. When my encrypted communication device buzzed with a personal message, my first assumption was that the notification represented some kind of security breach. Personal communications were restricted during active operations, and the fact that anything had penetrated our operational security protocols should have been impossible. The message was brief and devastating. "Victoria, your father passed away this morning from a massive heart attack. Funeral arrangements are being made for Saturday at St. Matthew's Episcopal Church in Riverside. However, after family discussion, we believe it would be best if you did not attend. Your presence would create unnecessary attention and disrupt the dignity of the service. We hope you understand. Please do not contact us during this difficult time." I read the message 3 times before the reality penetrated my consciousness. My father, Colonel Robert Sterling, United States Army retired, was dead. The man who had taught me to shoot, to think strategically, to understand that duty meant sacrificing personal comfort for principles larger than yourself, had suffered a heart attack while I was halfway around the world protecting people who would never know his name or mine. But the second part of the message was somehow more devastating than the first. My own family was banning me from attending his funeral. I stepped outside the bunker into the cold mountain air, my breath forming clouds in the darkness, as I tried to process what felt like a complete disconnection from reality. For 15 years I had served my country with distinction, rising through the ranks faster than almost any officer in my generation. I had led combat operations in Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, and a dozen other locations that remained classified. I had been wounded in action 3 times, received commendations from presidents and foreign heads of state, and commanded units that had prevented terrorist attacks, rescued hostages, and eliminated threats that kept American civilians safe while they slept. None of that mattered to my family. The irony was suffocating in its completeness. I was currently leading an operation to protect European civilians from a terrorist threat, but my own family considered my service an embarrassment that would disrupt their suburban funeral plan. My commanding officer, Lieutenant Colonel Rodriguez, found me sitting on a supply crate behind the bunker staring at the encrypted device that contained my mother's message. As one of the few officers who knew details about my family's situation, he immediately recognized that something significant had occurred. "Sterling, what's your status?" he asked, using the professional tone that indicated he was assessing whether I remained operationally effective or needed to be relieved of duty. "My father died, sir," I replied, maintaining the controlled voice that 15 years of military training had made automatic. "Massive heart attack this morning, Eastern Time." Rodriguez was quiet for several seconds, understanding that losing a parent during active deployment represented one of the most difficult challenges that military personnel faced. "Do you need to request emergency leave? We can extract you within 6 hours if necessary." I looked down at my mother's message again, reading the words that had somehow hurt more than 3 combat wounds. "Negative, sir. Family has requested that I not attend the funeral. I am fully mission capable and ready to proceed with operational timeline." The expression on Rodriguez's face indicated that he understood there was more to the situation than standard family logistics, but military protocol prevented him from inquiring further into personal matters unless they affected operational readiness. "Sterling, I've worked with you for 4 years. Your judgment and leadership have been exemplary under extreme conditions. If you assess that you can maintain operational effectiveness, I trust that assessment. However, if circumstances change, you will inform me immediately." Understood, sir. That night, as my unit prepared for the operation that would culminate 6 weeks of intelligence gathering and strategic positioning, I found myself reflecting on the journey that had led to this moment of complete family rejection. Growing up in Riverside, California, I had been raised in a household where military service represented the highest form of public duty. My father, Robert Sterling, had served 30 years in the Army, rising to the rank of colonel before retiring to work as a defense contractor. My mother, Patricia, had been an Army wife who understood the sacrifices required by military families and took pride in the service that kept our nation secure. Our home had been filled with military history, strategic thinking, and discussions about honor, duty, and sacrifice that shaped my understanding of what it meant to live according to principles larger than personal comfort. Family dinners included conversations about historical battles, analysis of contemporary geopolitical situations, and expectations that service to country represented the most meaningful way to spend a life. My older brother, Michael, had followed our father into the Army, serving 8 years as an infantry officer before transitioning to civilian career in corporate security. My younger sister, Jennifer, had chosen a different path, studying education and becoming an elementary school teacher. Both had married, started families, and settled into conventional suburban lives within 50 miles of our childhood home. I had always been different from my siblings in ways that our father seemed to appreciate, but that created tension with other family members. While Michael excelled at following established procedures and Jennifer found fulfillment in traditional domestic roles, I had been drawn to complex problem-solving, strategic innovation, and leadership challenges that required operating outside conventional parameters. During high school, while my classmates focused on college preparation and social activities, I had spent weekends at military history museums, summer breaks attending civilian versions of military leadership programs, and free time reading biographies of military leaders who had shaped world history through strategic thinking and decisive action. My decision to attend West Point rather than a traditional university had been supported enthusiastically by my father but received with more complex emotions from my mother and siblings. Military service was honorable, they believed, but they had hoped I would choose a path that allowed for more conventional family life and less personal risk. My graduation from West Point and commissioning as a second lieutenant in military intelligence had been a moment of family pride, but it had also marked the beginning of a gradual divergence between my life choices and their expectations for my future. Military intelligence specialization had led to assignments that required extensive travel, long deployments, and involvement in operations that could not be discussed with family members who lacked appropriate security clearances. Within 5 years, the gap between my daily reality and their understanding of my career had become substantial enough to create persistent tension during family gatherings. The tension had escalated as my military career advanced beyond what they had expected or understood. Promotion to captain, then major, then lieutenant colonel had come with increasing responsibilities, longer deployments, and involvement in operations that carried both higher strategic importance and greater personal risk. My family's discomfort with my military service had reached a tipping point 3 years earlier, when I had been selected for promotion to colonel and assigned to lead a classified unit responsible for counterterrorism operations worldwide. The promotion had represented the pinnacle of military achievement for someone my age, but it had also meant accepting responsibilities that would require even longer separations from family and involvement in operations that carried life-or-death consequences. During my last visit home, approximately 18 months before my father's death, the underlying tensions had finally erupted into open conflict. My mother had arranged what she described as a family intervention, where my siblings had been enlisted to convince me to leave military service and pursue what they considered a more appropriate career path. "Victoria, you're 34 years old," my sister Jennifer had said, sitting across from me at our parents' dining room table. "Most women your age are married with children. You're missing the most important experiences of life because you're obsessed with this military fantasy." My brother Michael had been more direct. "Cess, I did my time in the Army, and I understand the appeal, but there comes a point where you have to grow up and think about building a real life. This commando stuff is fine for movies, but it's not sustainable for actual human beings." Even my father, who had previously supported my military career unconditionally, had expressed concerns about the direction my service had taken. Victoria, I'm proud of your achievements and your dedication to duty, but your mother and siblings are worried about your safety and your future. Perhaps it's time to consider transitioning to civilian career, where you can use your leadership skills without the constant risk and isolation. I had tried to explain that my work involved preventing terrorist attacks, protecting American interests, and serving in ways that few people were qualified or willing to undertake. I had described the satisfaction of leading teams that accomplished missions with strategic importance, the intellectual challenge of complex operations, and the sense of purpose that came from knowing my service made a genuine difference in global security. Their response had been dismissive and condescending. My mother had suggested that I was using military service to avoid the responsibilities of normal adult life. My siblings had implied that my commitment to duty was actually selfishness disguised as patriotism. Even my father had questioned whether my dedication to military excellence was preventing me from developing the relationships and experiences that would provide long-term fulfillment. The conversation had ended with my mother delivering what amounted to an ultimatum: choose between military service and family relationships. She had made clear that continued advancement in my military career would result in gradual estrangement from family gatherings, holidays, and the support network that they believed I would eventually need when my military phase ended. I had chosen military service. For the following 18 months, communication with my family had become increasingly formal and infrequent. Phone calls had been reduced to brief exchanges about logistics and health updates. Holiday visits had been skipped due to operational requirements that my family interpreted as deliberate avoidance. The gap between my life and their understanding had widened to the point where we existed in completely separate worlds that intersected only through obligation rather than genuine connection. Now, as I sat in a mountain bunker preparing to lead an operation that could prevent civilian casualties across multiple countries, I realized that my father had died believing that his daughter had chosen career advancement over family relationship. He had passed away thinking that the principles he had taught me about duty and service had somehow been corrupted into selfishness and isolation. The pain of that realization was more devastating than any physical wound I had sustained in combat. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. But as I prepared my gear for the operation that would begin in 8 hours, I also recognized something that my family had never understood about military service. The mission we were about to execute would succeed or fail based on strategic planning, tactical execution, and leadership decisions that required the kind of training, experience, and dedication that could only be developed through years of commitment that appeared excessive to people who had never faced life or death responsibility for others' safety. The terrorist cell we had been tracking for 6 weeks represented a genuine threat to civilian populations. Intelligence indicated they possessed both the capability and intention to execute coordinated attacks that could kill hundreds or thousands of innocent people. Our operation would either prevent those attacks or fail and bear responsibility for the consequences of that failure. My family saw my military service as a choice to prioritize career over relationship. I understood it as accepting responsibility for protecting people who would never know they had been in danger, including family members who questioned the value of that protection. The operation began at 0600 hours and concluded successfully 72 hours later with the capture of the terrorist cell and seizure of materials that confirmed the intelligence assessment about planned attacks on civilian targets. My unit's performance had been flawless, preventing what intelligence analysts later confirmed would have been the deadliest terrorist attack in European history. But while we were securing the operational area and preparing evidence for prosecution, my father was being buried 3,000 miles away by family members who considered my absence a final confirmation that military service had made me incapable of understanding what truly mattered in life. I received word of the funeral's completion through a brief text message from my brother. Dad was buried this afternoon. Service was beautiful and dignified. We hope you're satisfied with your choices. 3 days later, I was boarding a military transport aircraft for return to the United States, carrying commendations for operational excellence that my family would never see, and memories of a successful mission that I could never share with the people who should have been most proud of my service. I had spent 15 years proving my worth to everyone except the people whose opinions I valued most. I had earned respect from military leaders worldwide, protected civilians across multiple continents, and demonstrated leadership under conditions that few people could handle, but I remained a disappointment to the family that had raised me to understand duty and honor. As our transport aircraft crossed the Atlantic, I made a decision that would define the next phase of my life. Instead of continuing to seek approval from family members who would never understand or appreciate military service, I would focus entirely on the mission and the people who depended on successful completion of operations that protected their safety and security. I had no way of knowing that decision would lead to achievements that would eventually change everything my family believed about duty, service, and what it truly meant to honor my father's memory. What I knew was that the text message banning me from his funeral had marked the end of one chapter of my life and the beginning of something that would require every lesson he had taught me about courage, integrity, and service to others. The foundation of everything I became was built on a military base in Fort Carson, Colorado, where I spent the first 8 years of my life watching my father demonstrate what it meant to serve something larger than yourself. Those early memories shaped every decision I would make for the next 3 decades, though my family would eventually come to see that influence as a curse rather than a blessing. Colonel Robert Sterling commanded respect without demanding it, led through example rather than authority, and understood that true strength came from protecting those who could not protect themselves. He never raised his voice to discipline his children, but we learned quickly that disappointing him was far worse than any punishment he might impose. His expectations were clear, consistent, and rooted in principles that he believed should guide every important decision in life. Our daily routine at Fort Carson reflected military precision but was tempered with genuine warmth and family connection. Reveille came at 0630 hours with my father's gentle but firm wake-up call, followed by family breakfast where he would discuss the day's plans and expectations, while my mother prepared meals that could feed a small battalion. These breakfast conversations became my earliest education in strategic thinking, problem-solving, and understanding how individual actions contributed to larger objectives. My father would explain military operations in terms that an 8-year-old could understand, using examples from his work to teach lessons about planning, execution, and accepting responsibility for outcome. When his unit successfully completed training exercises, he would describe how careful preparation and teamwork had contributed to success. When operations encountered problems, he would analyze what had gone wrong and how those mistakes could be prevented in future situations. These conversations taught me that leadership meant accepting responsibility for both successes and failures, that complex problems required systematic analysis rather than emotional responses, and that the most important decisions often involved choosing between what was easy and what was right. My father never presented these as abstract concepts, but as practical principles that guided his daily work and family life. Military families understand sacrifice in ways that civilian families often cannot comprehend. During my childhood at Fort Carson, I watched my mother manage household responsibilities while my father deployed for extended training exercises, observed neighbors supporting each other when spouses were assigned to different bases, and learned that military service required flexibility, resilience, and commitment that extended far beyond individual family interests. The base community functioned as an extended family where rank mattered for professional purposes but disappeared during Little League games, neighborhood barbecues, and crisis situations when someone needed help. Children learned early that their father's or mother's military service was both a source of pride and a responsibility that sometimes required significant personal sacrifice. My earliest understanding of courage came from watching military families handle deployment separations, permanent change of station moves, and the constant uncertainty that accompanied military life. These families maintained strong relationships despite geographic distance, created stability for children despite frequent relocations, and supported each other through challenges that would overwhelm many civilian communities. But the most profound influence on my character development came from observing how my father approached his professional responsibility. Colonel Sterling commanded a logistics battalion responsible for maintaining supply lines that kept other units operational during training exercises and actual deployment. His work required coordinating complex operations involving hundreds of personnel, millions of dollars in equipment, and timeline requirements that allowed no margin for error. I would accompany him to his office during school holidays and summer breaks, observing how he interacted with subordinates, managed competing priorities, and made decisions that affected numerous people and critical operations. His leadership style emphasized clear communication, thorough preparation, and taking care of the soldiers under his command before attending to his own needs. Watching my father work taught me that true leadership meant accepting responsibility for others' welfare, that effective decision-making required gathering complete information before taking action, and that maintaining high standards was essential for achieving results that justified the trust others placed in your judgment. These lessons shaped my understanding of what it meant to serve in positions of authority and responsibility. The contrast between military and civilian approaches to problem-solving became apparent when we relocated to Riverside, California, after my father's retirement from active duty. The transition from military base community to suburban civilian environment revealed fundamental differences in how people approached relationships, responsibilities, and community engagement. Civilian neighbors seemed more focused on individual family interests rather than collective community welfare. Professional relationships appeared more competitive and less collaborative than military unit cohesion. Social gatherings revolved around entertainment and status display rather than mutual support and shared purpose that characterized military community events. My parents adapted to civilian life with varying degrees of success. My father transitioned to defense contractor work that utilized his military expertise, while allowing him to maintain connections with active duty personnel and defense industry professionals. His civilian colleagues respected his military background and sought his advice on projects requiring strategic planning and operational efficiency. My mother found civilian social dynamics more challenging to navigate. Military spouse communities had provided clear social structures, shared experiences, and mutual support systems that civilian neighborhoods lacked. Her attempts to establish similar connections with civilian neighbors met with limited success, creating a sense of isolation that she had never experienced during military family life. The impact of this transition on my siblings and me varied significantly based on our ages and individual personality. Michael, my older brother, had spent most of his childhood on military bases and adapted easily to civilian social environments, while maintaining appreciation for military values and culture. Jennifer, my younger sister, had been young enough during the transition to integrate seamlessly into civilian community life without feeling displaced or different from her peers. My own response to civilian life was more complex and would eventually contribute to family tensions that persisted for decades. At 14 years old, I felt disconnected from civilian peer culture that seemed focused on activities and concerns that appeared trivial compared to the serious purposes that had defined military community life. High school social hierarchies based on popularity, fashion, and entertainment preferences seemed meaningless compared to merit-based recognition systems that characterized military environments. Academic achievement provided some satisfaction, but civilian educational institutions lacked the sense of mission and collective purpose that had made military community life meaningful. Teachers and classmates pursued individual success rather than contributing to shared objectives that benefited entire communities. Competition was encouraged, but cooperation was often viewed with suspicion rather than recognized as essential for achieving complex goals. During high school, I increasingly found myself drawn to activities that reflected military values and culture. I joined junior ROTC, participated in leadership development programs, and spent free time reading military history and biographies of military leaders who had shaped world events through strategic thinking and decisive action. These interests set me apart from civilian peers who were focused on typical teenage concerns about relationships, social status, and entertainment. My parents supported these interests but also encouraged me to develop friendships and participate in activities that would help me integrate into civilian community life. They arranged social opportunities with neighbors' children, encouraged participation in civilian youth organizations, and hoped that exposure to different perspectives would broaden my understanding of life beyond military culture. Despite their efforts, I continued to feel most comfortable in environments that reflected military values of duty, honor, service, and collective responsibility. Civilian social activities often seemed superficial and self-centered compared to military community events that served larger purposes and brought people together around shared commitments to service and sacrifice. The divergence between my values and civilian peer culture became more pronounced during my final years of high school, when college and career planning required decisions about future direction. Most classmates were selecting universities based on social opportunities, campus amenities, and degree programs that would lead to careers focused on personal financial success and lifestyle preference. My own college planning centered on institutions that would prepare me for military service and leadership responsibilities that would allow me to contribute to national security and public service. The United States Military Academy at West Point represented the ideal combination of academic excellence, leadership development, and commitment to service that aligned with everything my father had taught me about meaningful professional purpose. The decision to apply for admission to West Point created the first significant family tension about my future direction. My father was proud of my academic achievements and military interest but concerned about the challenges and sacrifices that military service would require. My mother worried about the physical dangers, social isolation, and personal limitations that military career would impose on my future options. Michael and Jennifer supported my military interest but hoped I would consider alternatives that would allow me to pursue leadership and service while maintaining more conventional lifestyle options. They suggested civilian universities with strong ROTC programs, government service opportunities, or private sector careers that would utilize leadership skills without requiring the total commitment that military service demanded. Family discussions about my college plans revealed fundamental differences in how we understood the relationship between personal fulfillment and service to others. My parents and siblings valued military service and respected those who chose military careers, but they also believed that civilian alternatives could provide similar satisfaction while offering greater flexibility and fewer personal risks. My own perspective was shaped by watching my father's transition from military to civilian work and observing the differences between military and civilian approaches to leadership, responsibility, and community engagement. Military service offered opportunities for meaningful purpose, clear mission focus, and collaborative achievement that civilian careers often lack. The application process for West Point required extensive documentation of academic achievement, leadership experience, physical fitness, and character references that demonstrated potential for military service and leadership development. Congressional nomination requirements meant that my application was evaluated not only by military education officials but also by civilian political representatives who assessed my potential for serving national interests. Receiving appointment to West Point represented validation of academic preparation, leadership potential, and character assessment that few high school graduates achieve. The appointment also represented commitment to military service obligation that would define my professional life for at least 8 years following graduation. My family's response to the West Point appointment was complex and would foreshadow tensions that would eventually lead to complete estrangement 15 years later. They were proud of my achievement and recognized the honor that military academy appointment represented, but they were also concerned about the implications for my personal life and future flexibility. The summer before entering West Point, family conversations about my future became increasingly focused on concerns about military service limitations rather than opportunities for leadership and service. My mother worried about physical dangers, social isolation, and reduced opportunities for marriage and family life. My siblings questioned whether military service was the best use of my leadership potential, and academic capabilities. Even my father, despite his pride in my military academy appointment, expressed concerns about the direction military service had taken since his own career. Modern military operations involved greater complexity, higher risk, and more extensive deployment requirements than the military service he had experienced during his 30-year career. These conversations revealed that my family's support for military service was conditional and limited by their understanding of acceptable risk and sacrifice. They respected military service in principle, but preferred that I pursue alternatives that would provide similar leadership opportunities without requiring the total commitment that effective military service demanded. The final family dinner before my departure for West Point became a defining moment that established patterns of interaction that would persist throughout my military career. My parents and siblings expressed pride in my achievement, while simultaneously communicating expectations that military service would be temporary and eventually give way to more conventional career and lifestyle choices. Their message was clear: military service was an honorable phase of life development, but long-term happiness and fulfillment would require transitioning to civilian careers that allowed for normal family relationships, community involvement, and personal interests that military service precluded. I entered West Point carrying both the values my father had instilled about duty, honor, and service, and also family expectations that those values would eventually be balanced against personal considerations that would lead me away from extended military service. The tension between these perspectives would shape every major decision I made during the following 15 years. What my family did not understand was that the principles my father had taught me about service and responsibility had become central to my identity in ways that made military service feel like calling rather than career choice. The sense of purpose that came from protecting others and serving national interests provided fulfillment that civilian alternatives could not match. This fundamental difference in understanding what constituted meaningful life purpose would eventually create a divide so significant that my own family would consider my dedication to military service a betrayal of everything they believed about priorities, relationship, and personal responsibility. They had raised me to understand honor and duty, but they had never anticipated that I would embrace those principles so completely that family approval would become secondary to military service obligation. The transformation from civilian teenager to military officer at West Point represented the beginning of a journey that would ultimately prove both my greatest strength and the source of deepest family conflict. The 4 years at the United States Military Academy fundamentally shaped my understanding of leadership, duty, and the price of excellence in ways that civilian education could never replicate. Beast Barracks, the intensive summer training program that preceded freshman academic year, eliminated approximately 15% of incoming cadets within the first 6 weeks. The physical, mental, and emotional demands were designed to identify individuals who possessed the resilience, adaptability, and commitment required for military leadership under extreme conditions. Those who survived learned that military excellence demanded standards that exceeded anything they had previously experienced. My academic performance at West Point consistently ranked within the top 5% of my class across multiple disciplines, including strategic studies, international relations, military history, and advanced mathematics. The Academy's academic program required mastering complex theoretical concepts while simultaneously developing practical leadership skills through military training exercises that simulated real-world operational challenges. Leadership development at West Point occurred through progressive responsibility assignments that began with managing small groups of fellow cadets and eventually progressed to commanding entire companies during advanced training exercises. These leadership opportunities provided immediate feedback about decision-making effectiveness, communication skills, and ability to maintain unit cohesion under pressure. My first significant leadership assignment came during sophomore year when I was selected as squad leader for a winter survival exercise in the Adirondack Mountains. The exercise required leading 12 cadets through a week-long tactical movement in sub-zero temperatures while accomplishing mission objectives that tested navigation, resource management, and team coordination under adverse conditions. The exercise began with equipment failure that eliminated our primary communication system, forcing my squad to operate independently while maintaining mission timeline and safety protocol. When one squad member suffered severe altitude sickness on the third day, I made the decision to split the unit, sending the ill cadet back with 2 escorts, while continuing the mission with the remaining 9 members. This decision violated standard protocols that required maintaining unit integrity during training exercises, but it ensured both mission accomplishment and personnel safety under circumstances that had not been anticipated by exercise planners. The tactical instructors later cited my decision-making as an example of adaptive leadership that prioritized substance over procedure when circumstances required innovative solutions. The successful completion of this exercise established my reputation among instructors and fellow cadets as someone who could maintain effective performance under pressure while making difficult decisions that balanced competing priorities. This reputation led to selection for increasingly challenging leadership assignments during junior and senior year. Military intelligence specialization during my final 2 years at West Point provided intensive training in analytical thinking, strategic assessment, and operational planning that would define my subsequent military career. The program required mastering foreign languages, cultural analysis, advanced technology applications, and intelligence assessment methodologies that prepared officers for complex operational environments. The capstone project for military intelligence specialization required developing a comprehensive strategic assessment of emerging security threats in a specific geographic region. My analysis focused on terrorist network evolution in Central Asia, examining how technological advancement and regional political instability were creating new operational capabilities for non-state actors seeking to threaten civilian population. This research project required 6 months of intensive analysis using classified intelligence sources, academic research, and consultation with active duty intelligence professionals who provided mentorship and feedback throughout the development process. The final assessment accurately predicted several terrorist operational patterns that would emerge in Central Asia during the following decade. My thesis advisor, Colonel Patricia Hayes, was a career military intelligence officer with 25 years of operational experience, who had served in some of the most challenging assignments available to intelligence professionals. Her mentorship during senior year provided insights into the realities of intelligence work that academic coursework could not convey. Colonel Hayes explained that effective intelligence work required combining analytical rigor with operational intuition, maintaining objectivity while understanding human motivations, and communicating complex assessments to decision-makers who often lack technical expertise in intelligence methodology. She emphasized that intelligence failures typically resulted from institutional pressure to provide convenient answers rather than accurate assessments that might complicate policy decisions. Her guidance proved invaluable when I encountered my first significant ethical challenge during senior year. A classified intelligence assessment that I had been assigned to review contained conclusions that appeared to be influenced by political considerations rather than objective analysis of available evidence. The assessment supported policy decisions that senior officials preferred, but the underlying intelligence did not justify the confidence levels that the assessment claimed. Challenging the assessment would have created complications for my academic standing and potentially affected graduation honors that would influence my initial military assignment. However, Colonel Hayes had taught me that intelligence integrity was fundamental to military effectiveness and that officers who compromised analytical objectivity for career advancement ultimately undermined the mission they were sworn to protect. I prepared a detailed critique of the assessment's methodology and conclusions, documenting specific instances where analytical rigor had been compromised to support predetermined policy positions. The critique was professionally written and focused on technical issues rather than political implications, but it clearly demonstrated that the assessment's conclusions were not supported by available evidence. Submitting this critique required accepting potential negative consequences for my academic standing and graduation honor. However, maintaining intellectual integrity seemed more important than protecting my academic record, particularly since my father had always emphasized that military officers must be willing to tell superiors unwelcome truths when mission effectiveness was at stake. The review board that evaluated my critique ultimately agreed with my analysis and required significant revisions to the original assessment, before it could be used for policy decisions. My willingness to challenge flawed analysis despite potential career consequences was noted by senior faculty and contributed to my selection for distinguished graduate honors that were awarded to the top 2% of graduating cadets. Graduation from West Point represented the culmination of 4 years of intensive preparation for military leadership and the beginning of active duty service that would test everything I had learned about command, responsibility, and commitment to mission accomplishment. Commissioning as a second lieutenant in military intelligence carried with it the promise of challenging assignments that would require applying theoretical knowledge to real-world operational challenges. My family attended graduation ceremonies with evident pride in my academic achievements and military honors, but their conversations during graduation weekend revealed continuing concerns about the direction my military career might take. They expressed hope that my intelligence specialization would lead to assignments that involved analytical work rather than operational deployments that carried physical risk and extended separation from family. During the graduation dinner, my mother specifically asked whether intelligence officers were typically assigned to combat zones, or whether they worked primarily in office environments that provided safety and regular communication with family members. Her questions reflected a fundamental misunderstanding of modern military operations and the role that intelligence professionals played in supporting combat units and special operations. My father, with his 3 decades of military experience, understood that intelligence officers often faced greater risks than traditional combat soldiers because their work required operating in uncertain environments with limited backup support and complex mission parameters. However, he chose not to correct my mother's misconceptions about intelligence work, perhaps hoping that my assignments would prove less dangerous than his experience suggested they might be. The conversation established a pattern that would persist throughout my military career. My family took pride in my achievements and advancement, while simultaneously hoping that my service would involve less risk, shorter deployments, and greater predictability than military service typically provides. They wanted me to succeed within military structure while avoiding the sacrifices that military success often required. My first assignment as a newly commissioned intelligence officer was to Fort Stewart, Georgia, where I was assigned to support the 3rd Infantry Division's intelligence operation. The division was preparing for deployment to Afghanistan, and my initial responsibilities involved analyzing threat patterns, briefing senior officers, and supporting operational planning for combat operations in a complex counterinsurgency environment. The learning curve during my first 6 months at Fort Stewart was steep and demanding. Transitioning from academic study of intelligence methodology to practical application in support of active combat operations required developing new skills, understanding operational constraint, unlearning to work effectively within military command structures that balanced multiple competing priorities. My immediate supervisor, Major Sarah Thompson, was a career intelligence officer who had served multiple combat deployments and understood both the technical requirements of intelligence work and the leadership challenges that young officers faced when transitioning from academy training to operational assignment. Her mentorship during this critical period shaped my understanding of how intelligence work contributed to mission success and personnel safety. Major Thompson explained that effective intelligence officers must maintain analytical objectivity while understanding that their assessments would influence decisions that affected soldiers' lives. She emphasized that intelligence work was ultimately about protecting people rather than just gathering information, and that the most important intelligence products were those that enabled commanders to make decisions that accomplished missions while minimizing casualties. Her guidance proved essential when I encountered my first significant intelligence challenge approximately 4 months into my assignment. Signals intelligence had identified communication patterns that suggested potential terrorist attack planning, but the intelligence was incomplete and required additional analysis to determine threat credibility and potential target location. Working with a team of experienced intelligence analysts, I spent 72 hours conducting intensive analysis of communication intercepts, movement patterns, and regional intelligence reporting to develop a comprehensive threat assessment. The analysis indicated a high probability of attack planning, but the potential target set included both military installations and civilian population centers, making it difficult to recommend specific protective measures. The final intelligence brief that I delivered to division leadership accurately assessed threat probability while acknowledging areas of uncertainty that required additional investigation. The brief recommended immediate protective measures for military installations, while also alerting local civilian authorities about potential threats to population centers within the operational area. Subsequent intelligence collection confirmed the accuracy of our threat assessment and led to successful interdiction of the terrorist cell before they could execute their planned attack. The operation prevented potential casualties among both military personnel and civilian populations, demonstrating how effective intelligence work could contribute to mission success and public safety. This successful intelligence operation established my reputation within the division as an analyst who could produce reliable assessments under pressure and communicate complex information effectively to decision-makers at multiple organizational levels. The recognition led to expanded responsibilities and selection for advanced training opportunities that would prepare me for more challenging assignments. The deployment to Afghanistan that followed 8 months later provided my first exposure to combat operations and the realities of military service in an active conflict zone. The deployment would last 15 months and involve intelligence support for combat operations against Taliban and al-Qaeda forces across multiple provinces in eastern Afghanistan. Afghanistan represented everything that civilian understanding of military service typically failed to comprehend. The operational environment was physically demanding, emotionally challenging, and intellectually complex in ways that required constant adaptation to changing circumstances and emerging threats. Success required combining theoretical knowledge with practical problem-solving skills while maintaining effectiveness under conditions of significant personal risk. My responsibilities during the Afghanistan deployment included briefing senior commanders, analyzing enemy activity patterns, supporting special operations, planning, and coordinating intelligence sharing with allied forces and civilian agencies. The work required 18-hour days, constant vigilance, and decision-making that could affect mission outcomes and personnel safety. The most challenging aspect of the deployment was the responsibility for providing intelligence assessments that would influence decisions about combat operations involving soldiers under my command. Unlike academic exercises where mistakes resulted in lower grades, intelligence failures in combat environments could result in casualties among people I knew personally and worked with daily. 6 months into the deployment, I was assigned to support a special operations mission targeting a high-value Taliban commander who had been responsible for multiple attacks against coalition forces and Afghan civilians. The mission required extensive intelligence preparation, including threat assessment, target analysis, and contingency planning for various operational scenarios. The intelligence preparation took 3 weeks and involved coordinating information from multiple sources, including human intelligence, signals intelligence, and surveillance assets that provided real-time information about target location and security arrangement. My analysis indicated that the target was heavily protected, but that the mission could be successful if executed during a specific time window when security would be reduced. The operation was executed successfully with no casualties among friendly forces and resulted in the capture of the Taliban commander along with intelligence materials that led to additional successful operations against terrorist networks in the region. The mission demonstrated how thorough intelligence preparation could enable complex operations to succeed, while minimizing risk to military personnel. The successful completion of this mission led to recognition from Special Operations leadership and selection for additional advanced training that would prepare me for even more challenging assignments. However, it also meant accepting responsibility for operations that carried higher stakes and required greater personal sacrifice. Communication with my family during the Afghanistan deployment became increasingly difficult as operational requirements prevented regular contact and security restrictions limited what information I could share about my work and living conditions. The gap between my daily reality and their understanding of my military service grew wider with each passing month. Their letters and occasional phone calls focused on concerns about my safety and questions about when I would return to assignments that would allow normal family communication and relationship. They interpreted my limited communication as evidence that military service was preventing me from maintaining family connections, rather than understanding that operational security and mission requirements sometimes made extensive personal communication impossible. The successful completion of my Afghanistan deployment earned commendation from senior leadership and recommendations for promotion and advanced assignments that would provide opportunities for greater responsibility and leadership development. However, these opportunities would also require accepting additional deployments and assignments that would further separate me from family expectations about military service limitations. Returning from Afghanistan after 15 months of intensive combat operations, I understood that military service had become more than career choice. The sense of purpose that came from protecting others and contributing to mission success provided fulfillment that civilian alternatives could not match. The deployment had also demonstrated capabilities and leadership potential that would lead to increasingly challenging and important assignments. My family's response to my successful completion of the Afghanistan deployment was complex and would foreshadow the tensions that would eventually lead to complete estrangement. They were proud of my service and relieved by my safe return, but they were also concerned about the changes they observed in my perspective and priorities following 15 months of combat operation. The promotion to captain that followed my Afghanistan deployment represented recognition of leadership effectiveness and potential for greater responsibility. However, it also meant accepting assignments that would require extended deployments, classified work that could not be discussed with family members, and leadership responsibilities that would affect the lives and safety of soldiers under my command. The gap between military service realities and family expectations was becoming unbridgeable, though none of us recognized at the time that my commitment to duty and excellence would eventually be interpreted as abandonment of family relationships and responsibilities that they believed should take priority over military service obligation. The trajectory toward complete family estrangement began during my promotion to major, when the convergence of professional achievement and personal sacrifice created irreconcilable differences between my commitment to military excellence and my family's expectations for conventional life choices. What they interpreted as gradual abandonment of family values was actually the natural progression of accepting greater responsibility for operations that protected national security interests and saved lives. The assignment to Fort Bragg represented a significant advancement in my military career, positioning me within the special operations community that handled the most sensitive and challenging missions in the contemporary security environment. Special Operations Command required officers who demonstrated exceptional analytical capabilities, operational judgment, and leadership effectiveness under conditions that conventional military training could not fully prepare personnel to handle. My initial assignment as operations officer for a classified intelligence unit involved coordinating support for special operations teams, conducting counterterrorism missions across multiple geographic regions. The position required security clearance levels that prevented discussing work details with family members, operational responsibilities that demanded irregular schedules and frequent travel, and decision-making authority that could affect mission outcomes with strategic implications. The work environment at Fort Bragg operated according to different standards and expectations than conventional military assignment. Personnel were selected based on demonstrated performance under extreme conditions, intellectual capabilities that enabled complex problem-solving, and psychological resilience that allowed maintaining effectiveness despite exposure to situations that would overwhelm most individuals. Professional relationships within the special operations community developed around shared understanding of mission importance, mutual respect for specialized capabilities, and collective commitment to achieving objectives that often required significant personal sacrifice. These relationships provided intellectual stimulation, emotional support, and sense of purpose that civilian social connections rarely met. My immediate supervisor, Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Webb, had served 15 years in special operations, with extensive experience in counterterrorism operations, intelligence analysis, and international security cooperation. His leadership style emphasized professional development, intellectual challenge, and graduated responsibility that prepared subordinate officers for increasingly complex assignments. Colonel Webb recognized analytical capabilities and operational judgment that qualified me for assignments requiring exceptional performance under demanding conditions. His mentorship during the first year at Fort Bragg provided insights into strategic thinking, international security dynamics, and leadership approaches that enabled managing complex operations with multiple stakeholders and competing priorities. The professional growth that resulted from Colonel Webb's mentorship and the challenging assignments at Fort Bragg created fulfillment and sense of purpose that exceeded anything I had previously experienced. The intellectual demands of strategic analysis, the leadership challenges of coordinating complex operations, and the knowledge that successful mission completion protected civilian populations provided satisfaction that civilian career alternatives could not replicate. However, the intensity of special operations work and the security requirements associated with classified missions created practical challenges for maintaining family relationships that operated according to conventional expectations about communication frequency, work schedule predictability, and social engagement patterns that civilian families typically enjoyed. Family visits during this period became increasingly strained as the gap between my daily reality and their understanding of military service continued to expand. Conversations about my work necessarily remained general and vague due to security restrictions, creating the impression that I was being deliberately secretive or evasive about professional activities that consumed the majority of my time and energy. My mother interpreted limited communication about work details as evidence that military service was changing my personality in concerning way. She observed that I seemed more serious, less emotionally expressive, and increasingly focused on responsibilities that prevented participating in family activities and social gatherings that had previously provided shared experiences and connection. During a family gathering approximately 18 months into my assignment at Fort Bragg, these concerns erupted into the first direct confrontation about the direction my military career was taking. My sister Jennifer had announced her engagement, and the family celebration provided an opportunity for extended interaction that revealed how significantly my perspective and priorities had evolved. The conversation began with routine questions about my work and living situation, but gradually shifted toward more fundamental concerns about my personal relationships, long-term planning, and commitment to family connections that they believed were being compromised by military service demands. Jennifer expressed concern that I seemed disconnected from family events and personal relationships that should provide emotional support and life satisfaction beyond professional achievement. She pointed out that most women my age were developing serious romantic relationships, planning marriages, and building social networks that would provide stability and fulfillment throughout their lives. My brother Michael approached the issue from a different perspective, questioning whether military service was providing adequate financial compensation and career advancement opportunities compared to civilian alternatives that would offer greater earning potential and professional flexibility. He suggested that my military achievements, while impressive, were limiting long-term options and preventing exploration of civilian career paths that might prove more rewarding. Even my father, despite his decades of military service and understanding of military culture, expressed concerns about the direction my career was taking. He acknowledged my professional achievements and recognized the importance of the work I was performing, but worried that total commitment to military service was preventing personal development and relationship building that would become increasingly important as I aged. The family intervention, as I later understood it to be, was carefully orchestrated to present unified concern about my life choices, while offering support for transitioning to civilian career paths that would provide better work-life balance and opportunities for conventional personal relationships. Their message was delivered with love and genuine concern, but it fundamentally misunderstood the source of fulfillment and purpose that military service provided. My attempts to explain the intellectual challenge, leadership opportunities, and sense of mission that made military service rewarding were met with polite acknowledgement, but little genuine understanding. They interpreted my passion for the work as evidence that I was using military service to avoid normal adult responsibilities, rather than recognizing that I had found meaningful purpose that aligned with my capabilities and values. The conversation concluded with implicit expectations that I would consider their concerns seriously and begin planning transition to civilian career that would allow greater family involvement and conventional lifestyle choices. They believed they were helping me recognize important life priorities that military service was preventing me from pursuing. Following this family intervention, I found myself in the unusual position of needing to justify career choices that provided deep satisfaction and contributed to national security objectives that protected the very freedoms my family enjoyed. The disconnect between their understanding of military service and the reality of my daily responsibilities seemed unbridgeable. Professional responsibilities at Fort Bragg continued to expand as my analytical capabilities and operational judgment earned recognition from senior leadership within the special operations community. The successful completion of increasingly complex assignments led to selection for advanced training opportunities and preparation for assignments requiring even greater levels of responsibility and expertise. The Advanced Strategic Intelligence course at the National Defense University provided 6 months of intensive education in strategic analysis, international security policy, and intelligence assessment methodologies that prepared senior officers for positions requiring sophisticated understanding of global security dynamics and operational planning capability. The curriculum included case studies of successful and failed intelligence operations, analysis of strategic decision-making processes during historical conflicts, and practical exercises in developing intelligence assessments that could guide policy decisions at the highest levels of government. The program required mastering complex theoretical frameworks while developing practical skills in communicating sophisticated analysis to decision-makers with varying levels of technical expertise. My performance during the Advanced Strategic Intelligence course ranked first among 37 military officers representing all service branches and intelligence specialties. The academic achievement reflected analytical capabilities and strategic thinking skills that qualified me for assignments requiring exceptional intellectual performance under demanding operational conditions. The professional recognition and advanced training opportunities that resulted from superior performance during this period created a positive feedback loop that reinforced my commitment to military excellence. Each successful assignment led to more challenging opportunities that required greater expertise and provided deeper sense of professional fulfillment. However, the trajectory toward increasingly specialized and demanding assignments also meant accepting responsibilities that would require extended deployments, irregular communication schedule, and involvement in operations that could not be discussed with family members who lacked appropriate security clearances. The promotion to lieutenant colonel that followed completion of the Advanced Strategic Intelligence course represented a significant milestone in military career progression and recognition of leadership potential that qualified me for command positions with substantial operational responsibility. The promotion also meant accepting assignment to positions that would test leadership capabilities under conditions that would challenge even experienced military officers. My new assignment as Deputy Commander of a Joint Special Operations Task Force responsible for counter-terrorism operations. The Horn of Africa represented the culmination of 8 years of professional development and preparation for leadership responsibilities that would affect the lives and safety of personnel under my command, while contributing to operations with strategic importance for regional stability and international security. The Horn of Africa operational environment presented complex challenges that required combining military expertise with diplomatic sensitivity, cultural understanding, and strategic thinking that could adapt to rapidly changing political and security conditions. Success required coordinating operations with multiple international partners, civilian agencies, and local government officials who brought different capabilities, priorities, and operational constraints to collaborative effort. My leadership responsibilities included planning and executing operations against terrorist networks that threatened both regional stability and international security interests. The missions required careful intelligence preparation, precise operational execution, and post-operation analysis that could inform future planning and strategic decision-making. The deployment to the Horn of Africa lasted 14 months, and involved operations that successfully disrupted terrorist networks, prevented planned attacks against civilian targets, and contributed to regional stability efforts that protected both local populations and international interests. The mission's success reflected effective leadership, strategic planning, and operational execution that earned recognition from senior military leadership and international partners. However, the deployment also required communication restrictions and operational security measures that made regular family contact impossible for extended periods. The nature of the missions and security considerations prevented sharing details about work activities that consumed the majority of my time and energy during the deployment. Family communication during this deployment became increasingly strained as they interpreted limited contact as evidence that military service was fundamentally changing my priorities and emotional connections to home relationships. Their letters expressed growing concern about my apparent distance from family activities and their perception that military service was becoming more important to me than family relationships. The successful completion of the Horn of Africa deployment earned commendation from senior leadership and led to selection for promotion to colonel and assignment to positions requiring even greater responsibility and leadership capability. The promotion represented recognition of exceptional performance and potential for continued advancement within the special operations community. My family's response to the promotion and subsequent assignment revealed that their concerns about military service had evolved from worries of safety and communication limitations to fundamental disagreement with life choices that prioritized military service over conventional personal relationships and family involvement. During my brief leave following the Horn of Africa deployment, family conversations focused increasingly on their belief that military service was preventing me from developing relationships and experiences that would provide long-term fulfillment and security. They expressed concern that total commitment to military excellence was limiting options for marriage, family development, and community involvement that would become increasingly important as I approached middle age. Their intervention strategy had evolved from expressing concern to actively encouraging specific alternative career paths that would provide similar leadership opportunities while allowing greater family involvement and conventional lifestyle choices. They researched civilian career options in consulting, government service, and private sector leadership that could utilize military experience while providing better work-life balance. The conversation that followed represented the final attempt at family reconciliation before the complete estrangement that would culminate in my exclusion from my father's funeral. Their message was clear: choose between continued military advancement and maintaining family relationships that they believed required demonstrating greater commitment to personal relationships and conventional life priorities. My response was equally clear. Military service provided purpose, fulfillment, and opportunities for meaningful contribution that civilian alternatives could not match. The intellectual challenges, leadership responsibilities, and knowledge that my work protected others provided satisfaction that justified the personal sacrifices that military excellence required. The conversation ended with implicit understanding that my continued advancement and military service would result in gradual estrangement from family relationships that required greater time, attention, and emotional investment than military responsibilities would allow. They had offered me a choice between military career and family acceptance, and I had chosen military service. The promotion to colonel and assignment as commander of the Joint Counter-Terrorism Task Force Omega represented the pinnacle of military achievement for an officer with 15 years of service. However, this professional triumph coincided with the complete dissolution of family relationships that had been deteriorating for years. The text message announcing my father's death and my exclusion from his funeral arrived during the most critical phase of an operation that would define my legacy within the Special Operations community. Task Force Omega operated under the highest levels of classification within the Department of Defense, conducting operations that protected American interests and civilian populations across multiple continents. The unit consisted of carefully selected personnel from all service branches, intelligence agencies, and specialized capabilities that enabled executing missions deemed impossible by conventional military standards. Command of this organization represented recognition of leadership abilities and strategic thinking that qualified me for the most challenging responsibilities within the modern military structure. The operational tempo of Task Force Omega required constant readiness for deployment to crisis situations that demanded immediate response and flawless execution. Team members maintained equipment and training standards that exceeded conventional military requirements, prepared for missions involving complex strategic objectives and operational parameters that changed rapidly based on evolving intelligence and political consideration. My command responsibilities included strategic planning for operations spanning months of preparation, tactical oversight of missions requiring split-second decision-making under extreme pressure, and coordination with senior government officials whose policy decisions were informed by intelligence assessments and operational recommendations that I provide. The position required combining military expertise with diplomatic understanding and political awareness that could navigate complex interagency relationships while maintaining mission focus. The intellectual demands of commanding Task Force Omega provided fulfillment that exceeded any previous professional experience. Each operation required mastering new technical information, analyzing complex intelligence data, and developing strategic approaches that could adapt to changing circumstances while maintaining effectiveness under conditions that would challenge the most experienced military leader. However, the security requirements and operational demands of the position made maintaining external relationships nearly impossible. Communication with anyone outside the immediate operational environment required security approval, personal activities were restricted by readiness requirements, and the psychological stress of responsibility for high-stakes operations affected social interactions in ways that civilian relationships could not accommodate. The isolation that accompanied command of Task Force Omega was professional rather than personal. Within the special operations community, I worked with individuals who understood the demands of classified operations, shared commitment to mission accomplishment above personal consideration, provided intellectual stimulation through complex problem-solving and strategic thinking that civilian social interactions rarely offer. The professional relationships within Task Force Omega were based on mutual respect for specialized capabilities, shared understanding of operational requirements, and collective commitment to achieving objectives that protected national security interests. These relationships provided emotional support, intellectual challenge, and sense of belonging that compensated for limitations in external social connection. The arrival of my mother's text message during the Eastern European operation curated cognitive dissonance that was difficult to process while maintaining operational effectiveness. The message indicated that my father had suffered a fatal heart attack, but the prohibition against attending his funeral suggested that my family's disappointment with my military career had evolved into complete rejection of my life choices and professional identity. Reading the message while positioned in an operational environment where my decisions affected the safety of personnel under my command and the success of missions with strategic implications curated a surreal contrast between personal devastation and professional responsibility. The immediate operational requirements prevented extensive emotional processing of the family situation, requiring compartmentalization skills that military training had developed but that civilian life rarely demanded. My response to the family situation was influenced by 15 years of military experience that had taught me to maintain operational effectiveness despite personal challenges. The mission in Eastern Europe required continued leadership and strategic thinking that could not be compromised by personal considerations, regardless of their emotional significance. Lieutenant Colonel Rodriguez recognized that I had received devastating personal news, but also understood that operational requirements took precedence over individual circumstances during active mission. His assessment that I remained mission-capable was based on observed performance rather than assumptions about emotional impact, reflecting military leadership principles that prioritized objective evaluation over sympathetic accommodation. The decision to continue the mission rather than request emergency leave was influenced by understanding that Task Force Omega operations protected civilian populations from terrorist threats that could result in mass casualties if prevention efforts failed. The personal cost of missing my father's funeral was significant, but the professional responsibility for preventing civilian deaths took precedence over individual grief and family expectation. The successful completion of the Eastern European operation prevented terrorist attacks that intelligence assessments suggested could have killed hundreds or thousands of innocent people across 3 European capitals. The mission outcome validated the decision to maintain operational focus despite personal circumstances, demonstrating how military service sometimes required choosing between individual needs and collective security requirements. However, the professional success did not diminish the emotional impact of family rejection during the most difficult period of my personal life. The realization that my own family considered my military service an embarrassment that would disrupt their social events was more devastating than any physical injury I had sustained during combat operations. The contrast between professional recognition and family rejection created psychological complexity that was difficult to reconcile. Within the military community, I was respected for leadership capabilities, strategic thinking, and operational achievements that contributed to national security and international stability. Within my family, I was viewed as someone who had chosen career advancement over personal relationships and community involvement that they considered more important than military service. The return journey from Eastern Europe provided opportunity for reflection on the fundamental disconnect between military service realities and civilian expectations about priorities, relationships, and meaningful contribution to society. The 18-hour flight included processing both the operational success that had prevented civilian casualties and the family rejection that had excluded me from my father's funeral. The professional debriefing that followed the Eastern European operation included recognition from senior leadership for strategic planning, tactical execution, and leadership effectiveness under challenging conditions. The mission's success contributed to my professional reputation and positioned me for continued advancement within the special operations community. The personal debriefing that accompanied processing my father's death and family estrangement was more complex and emotionally challenging. The realization that military service had created an unbridgeable gap between my values and family expectations required accepting that professional fulfillment would come at the cost of conventional relationships and social connections that most people considered essential for personal happiness. The memorial service that my family conducted for my father occurred while I was completing operational responsibilities that could not be delegated or postponed. The timing created the appearance that military service took precedence over family obligations, reinforcing their belief that I had prioritized career advancement over personal relationships and emotional commitments. My attempt to honor my father's memory through private reflection, continuation of service that embodied the values he had taught me about duty and responsibility, was not understood or appreciated by family members who expected physical presence and emotional expression that demonstrated conventional grieving patterns and family solidarity. The letters and messages that I received from family members following the funeral emphasized their disappointment with my absence and their interpretation that military service had fundamentally changed my character in ways that made me incapable of understanding priorities that normal people considered essential for personal fulfillment and social responsibility. My brother Michael's message was particularly direct in expressing family sentiment about my military career and its impact on personal relationships. He wrote that they had hoped military service would be a temporary phase that would eventually give way to civilian career choices that allowed greater family involvement and conventional lifestyle patterns. My sister Jennifer's communication focused on missed opportunities for relationship building and emotional connection that they believed military service was preventing me from experience. She expressed concern that total commitment to military excellence was limiting personal development and social engagement that would become increasingly important as I aged without conventional support systems. Even my mother's final communication before implementing complete contact cessation emphasized their collective disappointment with life choices that prioritized professional achievement over family relationships and community involvement that they considered more meaningful than military service contribution. The family's unified message was clear. Military service had changed me in ways that made me incompatible with their values and expectations about priorities, relationships, and social responsibility. They interpreted my commitment to duty and mission accomplishment as selfishness disguised as patriotism, and my dedication to protecting others as avoidance of personal emotional commitments. The irony of their perspective was painful to contemplate. The values that my father had taught me about duty, honor, and service to others had led to military achievements that protected the very freedoms and security that allowed my family to maintain their comfortable civilian lifestyle and express their disappointment with my career choices. The complete communication cessation that followed the funeral represented their final attempt to pressure me into abandoning military service in favor of civilian career alternatives that would allow greater family involvement and conventional personal relationships. They believed that social isolation would eventually force me to recognize that military service could not provide the emotional fulfillment and social connections that they considered essential for long-term happiness. The psychological impact of family rejection during the grieving process was compounded by professional responsibilities that required maintaining operational effectiveness while processing personal loss and social isolation. The demands of commanding Task Force Omega prevented extensive emotional processing of family estrangement, requiring compartmentalization skills that protected operational performance but potentially delayed grief resolution. The support system available within the military community provided some compensation for family rejection, but professional relationships could not fully replace emotional connections and shared history that family relationships had provided throughout my life. The loss of family support during my father's death created a form of double grief that affected both personal and professional dimensions of my identity. The decision to continue pursuing military excellence, despite family opposition, required accepting permanent estrangement from people whose approval and support had been important throughout my development. The choice represented commitment to values and principles that transcended individual relationships, but it also meant accepting isolation that would affect every aspect of my personal life. The months following my father's funeral and family estrangement were characterized by intense focus on professional responsibilities that provided purpose and achievement, but could not eliminate the emotional impact of losing both parental guidance and family connection during the same period. The grief was complicated by understanding that reconciliation would require abandoning military service that provided meaning and contributed to objectives larger than individual happiness. The professional advancement that continued during this period included recognition for operational achievements, selection for advanced training opportunities, and preparation for assignments requiring even greater leadership responsibility. However, the personal cost of these achievements included accepting that success within the military community would come at the expense of relationships and social connections that civilian society considered essential for personal fulfillment. The transformation from someone who had grown up in a supportive military family to someone whose military achievements were rejected by that same family represented a fundamental shift in identity and social orientation. The change required developing independence and self-reliance that went beyond professional capabilities to include emotional resilience and psychological strength that could maintain effectiveness despite social isolation. The period of adjustment following family estrangement also included recognizing that military service had become more than career choice or professional identity. The sense of purpose that came from protecting others and contributing to missions with strategic importance had evolved into a calling that provided meaning and fulfillment that civilian alternatives could not replicate, regardless of their social acceptability or family approval. The decision to embrace military service fully, despite family rejection and social isolation, represented commitment to principles and values that transcended individual relationships and personal comfort. The choice required accepting that meaningful contribution sometimes demanded sacrifices that others could not understand or appreciate, but that were justified by outcomes that protected people who would never know they had been in danger. The 18 months following my father's funeral marked the most professionally challenging period of my military career, as the combination of family estrangement and evolving political pressures within the defense establishment created obstacles that threatened to derail everything I had worked to achieve. The very success that had earned me command of Task Force Omega also made me a target for political maneuvering that would test my resilience and commitment to military service in ways that combat operations had never required. The political environment within the Department of Defense had shifted significantly during my deployment to Eastern Europe, with new leadership prioritizing different strategic approaches and operational philosophies than those that had guided special operations for the previous decade. The change in administration brought defense officials who questioned the effectiveness of small unit special operations in favor of conventional military approaches that emphasized diplomatic engagement and economic development over direct action against terrorist threats. Task Force Omega found itself under increased scrutiny from Pentagon officials who viewed specialized counterterrorism units as remnants of previous strategic thinking that no longer aligned with contemporary foreign policy objectives. The successful operations that had previously earned recognition and increased funding were now interpreted as evidence of military approaches that created more problems than they solved through regional destabilization and international complications. The bureaucratic challenges that accompanied this political shift required defending operational methodologies and strategic assessments to officials who lacked understanding of special operations capabilities and limitations. Briefings that had previously focused on mission planning and resource allocation became exercises in justifying the continued existence of specialized units whose effectiveness could not be easily quantified through conventional metrics. My position as Task Force Omega commander placed me at the center of these political dynamics, requiring navigation of interagency relationships and congressional oversight processes that were fundamentally different from operational leadership challenges. The skills that had enabled successful mission planning and tactical execution did not necessarily translate to political advocacy and bureaucratic maneuvering that determined funding and operational authorization. The professional isolation that resulted from these political challenges was compounded by the continuing impact of family estrangement that had eliminated personal support systems during the most stressful period of my career. The combination of professional uncertainty and personal isolation created psychological pressures that tested resilience and commitment in ways that previous challenges had not approached. The first indication of serious political threat to Task Force Omega came during a routine budget review meeting with senior Pentagon officials who questioned the cost-effectiveness of specialized operations compared to conventional military alternatives. The meeting, which should have been a straightforward presentation of operational achievements and resource requirements, became a hostile interrogation of operational necessity and strategic value that challenged fundamental assumptions about counterterrorism effectiveness. Deputy Secretary of Defense Margaret Harrison led the review with skepticism about special operations that reflected broader administration concerns about military approaches that operated outside traditional diplomatic and economic frameworks. Her questions focused on quantifying operational success in ways that conventional military metrics could not accurately capture, creating expectations for evidence that specialized units were not designed to provide. The challenge of defending Task Force Omega operations to officials who fundamentally disagreed with special operations philosophy required developing new communication strategies and documentation approaches that could translate tactical achievements into political justification. The process was intellectually demanding and emotionally exhausting, requiring constant vigilance to protect operational capabilities while satisfying bureaucratic requirements that seemed designed to undermine specialized military effectiveness. The bureaucratic warfare that developed around Task Force Omega funding and authorization consumed increasing amounts of time and energy that had previously been devoted to operational planning and mission execution. Preparing for congressional testimony, developing strategic assessments for political audiences, and coordinating with other agencies that had different priorities and operational constraints became major components of command responsibility. The personal cost of this bureaucratic engagement was significant. requiring skills and psychological approaches that were fundamentally different from military leadership and operational decision-making. The political environment demanded compromise, accommodation, and strategic ambiguity that conflicted with military values of clarity, decisiveness, and mission focus that had guided my professional development. During this period of political pressure and professional uncertainty, the absence of family support became particularly pronounced. The stress of defending Task Force Omega operations and managing personnel concerns during budget uncertainty would have been challenging under any circumstances, but the lack of personal relationships and emotional support systems made the situation nearly overwhelming. The professional relationships within the special operations community provided some emotional support and practical assistance during this difficult period, but military colleagues faced their own career uncertainties and political pressures that limited their ability to provide extensive personal guidance or emotional reinforcement. The institutional culture of military service emphasized individual resilience and self-reliance that discouraged extensive discussion of personal challenges or emotional difficulties. The isolation was compounded by security restrictions that prevented discussing operational details or political challenges with anyone outside the immediate special operations community. The classified nature of Task Force Omega operations meant that the professional pressures and political obstacles I faced could not be shared with therapists, civilian friends, or other potential sources of emotional support who lacked appropriate security clearances. The psychological impact of combining professional uncertainty with personal isolation created stress levels that affected physical health, decision-making effectiveness, and emotional stability in ways that required conscious effort to maintain operational capability. The challenge of leading Task Force Omega personnel through budget uncertainties and political pressures, while managing personal psychological pressures, demanded resilience that exceeded previous professional requirements. The most significant political challenge came during congressional testimony that was designed to evaluate the effectiveness of special operations funding and determine whether Task Force Omega operations should continue under current authorization. The hearing represented a make-or-break moment for the organization and the personnel whose careers depended on continued special operations support. Congressional testimony required presenting complex operational information to elected officials who had varying levels of understanding about military capabilities and strategic requirements. The challenge was communicating tactical achievements and strategic value in ways that political audiences could appreciate, while maintaining security requirements that prevented discussing specific operations or intelligence sources. Preparation for congressional testimony involved weeks of briefing development, practice sessions with Pentagon officials, and coordination with congressional staff who provided guidance about political concerns and questioning approaches that committee members were likely to pursue. The process required mastering political communication skills that were fundamentally different from military briefing techniques. The testimony itself was a grueling 6-hour session with representatives who brought different political perspectives and varying levels of military understanding to their evaluation of special operations effectiveness. Some committee members were supportive of military capabilities and interested in ensuring adequate funding for national security requirements. Others were skeptical of military spending and focused on identifying inefficiencies and redundancies that could justify budget reduction. The most challenging questions came from representatives who fundamentally opposed specialized military operations and viewed Task Force Omega as an example of excessive military spending that diverted resources from domestic priorities. These questions required defending not just operational effectiveness, but the entire philosophical approach to counterterrorism and international security that special operations represent. My responses to congressional questioning emphasized operational achievements that had prevented terrorist attacks, protected civilian populations, and contributed to regional stability in ways that conventional military approaches could not replicate. The testimony included specific examples of successful missions that demonstrated tactical effectiveness and strategic value, while maintaining security requirements that prevented discussing classified details. The congressional hearing concluded without clear resolution about Task Force Omega funding, leaving the organization in bureaucratic limbo that affected morale, operational planning, and personnel retention. The uncertainty created additional stress for military personnel who faced career decisions about whether to remain in special operations or seek assignments in conventional military units that had more predictable funding and political support. The months following congressional testimony were characterized by continued political maneuvering and bureaucratic processes that gradually eroded Task Force Omega capabilities through budget restrictions, personnel reassignment, and operational limitations that prevented effective mission execution. The death by 1,000 cuts approach eliminated the organization's effectiveness without requiring explicit political decisions about program termination. The personal impact of watching Task Force Omega dissolve despite successful operational performance was devastating in ways that combat losses had never approached. The realization that political considerations could override military effectiveness and strategic necessity challenged fundamental assumptions about merit-based advancement and institutional support for excellence that had motivated my entire military career. The professional isolation that accompanied Task Force Omega's political difficulties was compounded by the broader impact on my career trajectory and advancement opportunity. The association with a politically controversial organization affected perceptions of my leadership capabilities and strategic judgment among senior officials who were responsible for promotion decisions and assignment selection. The combination of political setbacks and personal isolation created a period of professional exile that was more challenging than any previous adversity I had encountered. The loss of operational command, the uncertainty about future assignments, and the absence of family support created psychological pressures that tested resilience and commitment in fundamental ways. The coping strategies that had enabled managing previous challenges proved inadequate for the combination of professional uncertainty and personal isolation that characterized this period. Military training had prepared me for physical danger, operational stress, and leadership challenges, but it had not provided tools for managing political defeat and social isolation simultaneously. The gradual dissolution of Task Force Omega also meant losing professional relationships and operational responsibilities that had provided purpose and intellectual stimulation throughout my military career. The work that had defined my professional identity and provided meaning beyond individual achievement was systematically eliminated through bureaucratic processes that valued political considerations over military effectiveness. The final dissolution of Task Force Omega came through administrative reorganization that transferred personnel to conventional military units, while eliminating specialized capabilities that had taken years to develop. The process was presented as efficiency improvement and resource optimization, but the practical effect was destroying institutional knowledge and operational capabilities that could not be easily reconstructed. My reassignment to a staff position at the Pentagon represented a significant reduction in operational responsibility and leadership authority compared to commanding Task Force Omega. The new position involved policy analysis and strategic planning that utilized my experience and expertise, but lacked the direct operational impact and personnel leadership that had provided satisfaction throughout my military career. The transition from operational command to staff position required adjusting expectations about professional fulfillment and accepting that career advancement might require accepting assignments that were less personally rewarding, but politically safer than specialized operations that had defined my previous military service. The Pentagon assignment also meant working within the same political environment that had destroyed Task Force Omega, requiring daily interaction with officials and policies that I had fundamental disagreements with regarding military effectiveness and strategic priority. The cognitive dissonance of supporting policies that contradicted my professional experience and strategic assessment created ongoing psychological stress. The period of professional exile and political defeat that followed Task Force Omega's dissolution represented the lowest point of my military career and personal life. The combination of losing operational command, family estrangement, and political setbacks created circumstances that challenged every assumption about merit-based advancement and institutional support for excellence that had motivated my military service. However, this period of adversity also provided opportunities for reflection and strategic thinking about military service, personal values, and long-term objectives that would eventually lead to innovations and achievements that exceeded anything I had previously accomplished. The forced transition from operational leadership to strategic analysis created space for developing new approaches to military effectiveness that would eventually revolutionize special operations doctrine and operational capability. The Pentagon staff assignment that followed the dissolution of Task Force Omega represented the nadir of both my professional trajectory and personal resilience. Working within the same institutional framework that had systematically dismantled 15 years of specialized expertise while simultaneously processing the permanent loss of family relationships, created psychological pressures that challenged my fundamental understanding of purpose, identity, and the value of military service itself. The Office of Strategic Planning and Policy Analysis occupied a sterile corridor on the third floor of the Pentagon, where mid-level officers produced assessments and recommendations that were rarely implemented and seldom acknowledged by senior decision-makers. The work environment reflected the bureaucratic reality of modern defense policy making, where political considerations consistently override military expertise and operational experience in determining strategic direction and resource allocation. My daily responsibilities involved analyzing international security trends, preparing briefing materials for senior officials, and participating in interagency coordination meetings that addressed complex global challenges through diplomatic and economic rather than military approaches. The intellectual content of the work was substantive and analytically demanding, but the practical impact on national security policy was minimal and often counterproductive to effective threat mitigation. The contrast between the high-stakes operational environment of Task Force Omega and the abstract policy analysis of Pentagon staff work was jarring and demoralizing. Previous assignments had involved a direct responsibility for missions that protected civilian populations and prevented terrorist attacks through decisive action and strategic innovation. Current responsibilities involved producing documents that would be read by officials who had already made decisions based on political rather than security considerations. The psychological adjustment to policy staff work was complicated by the realization that my specialized expertise in counterterrorism operations and strategic planning was not valued or utilized within the current defense establishment. The knowledge and capabilities that had been developed through 15 years of operational experience were treated as outdated relics of previous strategic thinking, rather than valuable resources for addressing contemporary security challenges. The institutional culture within the Office of Strategic Planning emphasized consensus building and political accommodation over analytical rigor and strategic clarity. Briefings were crafted to support predetermined policy positions rather than provide objective assessments that might complicate diplomatic initiatives or economic development programs. The intellectual dishonesty that characterized much of the work conflicted with military values of accuracy, thoroughness, and mission focus that had guided my professional development. The professional frustration of producing politically motivated analysis was compounded by the continuing impact of family estrangement that had eliminated personal support systems during the most difficult period of my career. The combination of meaningful work loss and relationship isolation created a form of double displacement that affected every aspect of daily life and long-term planning. Evening hours in my Arlington apartment became exercises in confronting the magnitude of what had been lost and the uncertainty of what might be recovered. The sparse furnishings and minimal personal effects reflected the transient lifestyle that military service had required, but also emphasized the absence of family connections and personal relationships that most people considered essential for psychological stability and life satisfaction. The silence that characterized evening hours was particularly pronounced after years of operational environments, where constant communication and collaborative problem-solving had provided intellectual stimulation and social interaction. The isolation was not merely physical, but intellectual and emotional, creating a void that reading, exercise, and professional development activities could not adequately fill. Sleep disturbances that had never affected me during combat deployments or high-stress operational periods became persistent during this period of professional displacement and personal isolation. The psychological impact of losing operational command, combined with family rejection, created anxiety patterns that resisted conventional coping strategies and affected both cognitive function and emotional regulation. The most challenging aspect of this period was not the external circumstances themselves, but the fundamental questioning of values and life choices that the circumstances provoked. For 15 years, military service had provided clear purpose, meaningful achievement, and intellectual satisfaction that justified personal sacrifices and family relationship. The current situation challenged whether those sacrifices had been worthwhile and whether continued military service could provide similar fulfillment and contribution. The core identity crisis involved reconciling the person I had become through military service with the person my family had expected me to remain. Their rejection was not merely disagreement with career choices, but fundamental disapproval of character changes that they attributed to military influence. They believed that military service had transformed me from someone who valued relationships and community into someone who prioritized individual achievement and abstract principles over human connection. Their perspective had some validity that was difficult to acknowledge, but impossible to ignore. Military service had indeed changed my personality, priorities, and social orientation in fundamental ways. The emphasis on mission accomplishment, strategic thinking, and collective security had reduced my interest in conventional social activities and personal relationships that did not contribute to larger purposes or meaningful objectives. The question that haunted this period of reflection was whether those changes represented positive development or character degradation. Had military service refined my values and capabilities in ways that enabled greater contribution to society, or had it created psychological limitations that prevented normal human happiness and social integration? The answer seemed to depend on whether military service could continue to provide opportunities for meaningful achievement that justified its personal costs. The professional environment at the Pentagon provided little evidence that continued military service would offer such opportunity. The policy analysis work was intellectually challenging but strategically irrelevant, requiring expertise that was not valued and producing recommendations that were not implemented. The career trajectory from this assignment appeared to lead toward additional staff positions that would utilize my experience in increasingly abstract ways, while providing diminishing opportunities for operational impact. The consideration of alternative career paths that had been unthinkable during previous periods of adversity became unavoidable during this extended period of professional displacement and personal isolation. The civilian employment opportunities that my family had encouraged for years suddenly appeared more attractive when compared to continued military service that might offer neither operational satisfaction nor career advance. The financial compensation for military service had never been a primary motivation, but the security and predictability of military benefits became more significant when considering the practical challenges of transitioning to civilian employment after 15 years of specialized military experience. The skills that had enabled successful special operations leadership did not necessarily translate to civilian career opportunities that offered comparable responsibility and intellectual challenge. The exploration of civilian alternatives revealed that private sector positions, utilizing military experience, typically involved consulting roles with defense contractors or security firms that supported government operations through outsourced services. These positions offered higher financial compensation than military service, but often involved working on the same policy issues and operational challenges that had become frustrating within the Pentagon bureaucracy. The prospect of continuing to work on defense and security issues while operating outside the military command structure and institutional culture held some appeal, but it also represented a form of surrender to political forces that had made effective military service increasingly difficult. Leaving military service would eliminate the bureaucratic constraints and political limitations that prevented optimal strategic thinking and operational effectiveness, but it would also mean abandoning the institutional framework that had provided purpose and identity throughout my adult life. The decision-making process about future career direction was complicated by the absence of personal relationships and family connections that typically provide guidance and support during major life transition. The isolation that had resulted from family estrangement meant that the most significant career decision of my life would be made without input from people who knew me well and cared about my long-term happiness and success. Professional colleagues within the military community could provide technical advice about career alternatives and practical guidance about transition processes, but their perspectives were necessarily limited by their own career interests and institutional loyalty. The conversation about leaving military service could not be entirely open and honest with people whose own advancement depended on demonstrating continued commitment to military institutions and values. The months of consideration and internal debate about future direction occurred against the backdrop of continuing political pressures within the defense establishment that suggested conditions for military professionals would become more rather than less challenging. The administration's emphasis on diplomatic and economic approaches to international security meant that military expertise would be increasingly marginalized in policymaking processes. The personal cost of this extended period of uncertainty and self-doubt was significant and cumulative. The combination of professional displacement, family estrangement, and career uncertainty created psychological stress that affected physical health, cognitive performance, and emotional stability in ways that required conscious effort to maintain basic functionality. Physical fitness routines that had been sources of stress relief and psychological stability during previous challenges became mechanical exercises that provided minimal emotional benefit or psychological restoration. The disciplined approach to physical conditioning that military culture emphasized could maintain physical health but could not address the deeper psychological challenges that characterized this period of displacement. The intellectual pursuits that had previously provided satisfaction and personal development became exercises in distraction rather than genuine engagement. Reading military history, studying strategic theory, and analyzing international security developments had been sources of professional growth and personal interest, but they now served primarily as methods for avoiding confrontation with fundamental questions about identity and purpose that required resolution. The turning point in this extended period of crisis came not through external intervention or institutional support, but through internal recognition that the current situation was ultimately unsustainable. The combination of professional frustration and personal isolation would eventually require decisive action to either restore meaningful engagement with military service or transition to alternative career paths that could provide purpose and satisfaction. The realization that change was necessary coincided with understanding that the decision about future direction would determine not only career trajectory but fundamental identity and life purpose for decades to come. The choice was not merely between military service and civilian employment, but between different approaches to contribution, achievement, and personal fulfillment that would define the remainder of my adult life. The internal dialogue that characterized this decision-making process eventually focused on core questions about values, capabilities, and meaningful contribution that transcended immediate career consideration. What forms of work and service would best utilize the knowledge and skills that had been developed through military experience? What environments would provide intellectual challenge and operational impact that could justify continued personal sacrifice and social isolation? The answers to these fundamental questions would ultimately lead to innovations and strategic thinking that would revolutionize special operations doctrine and create opportunities for contribution that exceeded anything I had previously imagined possible. However, reaching those answers required confronting the possibility that conventional military service might no longer provide the optimal framework for utilizing my capabilities and achieving meaningful impact on national security and international stability. The dark night of the soul characterized this period of displacement, and uncertainty was ultimately necessary preparation for the intellectual breakthrough and strategic innovation that would define the next phase of my career and vindicate the personal sacrifices that military service had required. The breakthrough that would transform my career and vindicate 15 years of service came through an unexpected convergence of technological advancement and strategic necessity that revealed fundamental flaws in contemporary military doctrine. While assigned to the sterile policy analysis environment of the Pentagon, I discovered that the most sophisticated terrorist networks were exploiting weaknesses in conventional intelligence gathering and response protocols that no existing military framework could adequately address. The revelation began during routine analysis of classified intelligence reports that documented the failure of traditional counterterrorism approaches against hybrid threat networks that combined technological sophistication with decentralized operational structure. These organizations operated across national boundaries, utilized advanced encryption technologies, and employed recruitment strategies that conventional intelligence services could not effectively monitor or disrupt. The intelligence reports revealed that terrorist networks had evolved beyond the organizational models that existing military doctrine was designed to combat. Rather than hierarchical command structures that could be disrupted through targeted elimination of leadership, these networks operated through distributed cells that maintained operational independence while sharing resources and intelligence through encrypted communication systems that traditional surveillance methods could not penetrate. The implications of this technological and organizational evolution were staggering for national security policy and military effectiveness. Every major counterterrorism operation of the previous decade had been designed to combat threat networks that no longer existed in the forms that military planning assumed. The failure to adapt doctrine and operational approaches to contemporary threat realities was creating vulnerabilities that sophisticated adversaries were systematically exploiting. The policy analysis work that had seemed irrelevant and bureaucratic suddenly became intellectually compelling. I recognized that the strategic assessments being produced by senior officials were based on fundamental misunderstandings of threat network capabilities and organizational structure. The disconnect between intelligence reality and policy assumptions was creating security vulnerabilities that would eventually result in successful terrorist operations against civilian and military targets. The realization that conventional military approaches were inadequate for contemporary security challenges sparked intense focus on developing alternative strategic frameworks that could address distributed threat networks through innovative operational concepts. The intellectual challenge of reimagining counterterrorism doctrine from first principles provided the sense of purpose and mission focus that had been missing during months of bureaucratic policy work. The initial research into alternative operational approaches required studying technological developments in artificial intelligence, network analysis, and distributed computing that were not typically incorporated into military strategic thinking. The intersection of advanced technology with military doctrine represented uncharted territory that offered opportunities for revolutionary innovation rather than incremental improvement of existing capability. The technological research revealed that machine learning algorithms could identify patterns in communication networks and resource flows that human analysts could not detect through conventional intelligence methods. These algorithms could process vast amounts of data from multiple sources simultaneously, identifying relationships and predicting behavioral patterns that would enable preemptive disruption of terrorist operations before they reached execution phase. The strategic implications of applying artificial intelligence to counter-terrorism operations were profound and far-reaching. Rather than reactive responses to terrorist attacks after they occurred, advanced analytics could enable predictive identification of threat development and proactive intervention that prevented attacks from reaching operational phases. The paradigm shift from response to prevention represented fundamental transformation of military effectiveness and strategic capability. The development of this revolutionary approach required combining expertise in military operations with technological capabilities that existed primarily in civilian research institutions and private sector technology companies. The interdisciplinary nature of the innovation demanded learning new technical skills while applying military experience to problems that had not been addressed through conventional defense research and development processes. Working 18-hour days in my Pentagon office, I began developing what would become known as the Predictive Network Disruption Protocol, a comprehensive framework for identifying, analyzing, and neutralizing distributed threat networks through real-time intelligence fusion and machine learning algorithms. The protocol represented synthesis of military operational experience with cutting-edge technological capabilities that could revolutionize counterterrorism effectiveness. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from